welcome back to Alejandro Yamashita and Martin Despang show, Urban Transcendence. Today we have a special guest, Kenneth Masden. Kenneth is an architect, and I allow myself to say in acting because it never ends, teaching and facilitating educator, and also a very philosophical scholar. So thanks for being here. And we talked before, you got to meet Thomas Lim because you guys have so much to share. Thomas was our guest last time, and my only fear is that you guys are going to explode or implode. But you share a lot. And I concluded the show without being able to say, because we ran out of time, what the species of an exotic is. And I would like to welcome you as being, for me, another great example for an exotic. And Thomas, working with the Department of Tropical Agriculture, told me that is a species that, if you want to call it, positive invasive. So it's a species that doesn't take over. It's a species that comes and complements an environment. And once I let you talk, which is now, people will hear an accent, which comes from somewhere else, and they probably look at you and see that you come from somewhere else. But you're another person that, for me, totally enriches the environment here, both in your intellectual capacity and also in your work that you're doing. So thanks again for being here, and maybe you explain to us a little bit where you come from, literally and figuratively speaking.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for assuming I'm not here to take over. I'm originally from Louisville, Kentucky. I'm an architect by education and practice. But in the later years, before coming here 4.5 years ago, I was an architectural professor at the University of Texas in San Antonio. And so what we're going to talk about today is research that came out of that time in my life. I have done architecture from design build, custom houses, up to large-scale planning installations around the country and around the world. And as you and I had talked, I had worked with Peter Eisenman, on the memorial to the murdered Jews of Berlin. And so there's some interesting things there. But today I came as an invitation to talk about intelligence-based design, which is something that I was working with a colleague of mine, Nico Salingaros, before I left San Antonio, Texas. And it's a good opportunity for me to revisit that topic and exchange with you.
So we had agreed that I throw in some provocative things that you got to live with one way or another. So, and we're going to talk about architecture and the architecture. And one way or another, we're going to talk about the architecture on this island here, which both is hosting us in a very welcoming way. But we want to be critical. That's the idea of the show here. So the question is, how intelligent has architecture been ever since its beginning? How intelligent is the existing reality, and how intelligent could it be in the future? So as a synopsis, maybe you give the audience a brief idea what that research of intelligence-based design is about, and there will actually be a book. If you know, this is encouraging you, saying there has to be a book.
There just needs to be final edits.
So as a precursor, what's that research about?
Well, we'll talk about it across the spectrum of human built environment. But let me start with what intelligence-based design is speaking to. It's talking about the intelligence that you find in the natural world, in the patterns, in the details, in the contrast, that the human neurological system, our perception, our eye-brain system, picks up on, that actually helped in evolving the human brain to understand and work within that environment. And so there's an expectation with the human neurological system and our brain for a great degree of complex, organized information. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of that in a minute, but if you want to consider it across the range of the human-built environment, you know, when humans first started to construct, to make artifacts, it was a time when they were trying to carve out an existence, and what they were working in is in the natural environments of the world. And so they were looking at examples of what was. But they were also operating with a neurological system that had, through an exchange, what we believe, between the mind and matter, that the information that is in the natural environments of Earth are imprinted in a way or mapped onto the neurological structures, because the neurological structures developed, the brain developed multiple regions in order to deal with complexity of existence in this kind of spatiality and this kind of materiality. So naturally, when humans started to make things, the brain was telling them, you know, this is how this is constructed. The material logic of what they were working with was informing things. But you start to find in early humans that they started putting into their artifacts patterns, scalar patterns, replicating patterns, different kinds of work, which at that time wasn't intellectualized. It was about kind of trying to connect with the material world. Since the natural environment had that kind of information already in it, you start seeing that when they started to, we call it an unself-aware kind of event. In other words, they're not thinking intellectually, oh, I'm going to design something. They just want to make something, and they're compelled to carve and to make and to do these kinds of this work. So that, as humans become more intelligent, they become more social, their intellectual side begins to advance as well. And they start looking at more complex ways to build. That's sort of the craftsman period, when you start looking at the innate environment, you start building. And in building with nature and natural materials, you're bringing those intrinsic information structures that we're talking about that resonate with the neural structure, you're bringing them to bear in what you build. And so up until it started, I guess, when architecture moved from a vocation like the master builder and moved into the university with the Renaissance, at that point it begins to become intellectualized. And not that that's a bad thing, because there are great advances from that, but you start seeing different kinds of meaning applied, different kinds of ideology, different kinds of valuings and beliefs, and this led towards, you know, I guess Alberti and the visual compositions. It made its way through Baroque and Rococo, and then what kind of, I guess, put a stop to it all, which someone might have argued was the opulence of the Rococo, was the Industrial Revolution. So in the Industrial Revolution, we started looking at the notion of standardizing, and the modernists that came out of that were looking at this, making built environments that were more pragmatic and more utilitarian. So all of this extraneous information that was put in other buildings, they wanted to sort of cast off. And that's the point where I think it was Walter Gropius who relegated architectural history to architectural historians.
That German guy, yes.
That German guy. And we sort of then said, okay, we're going to reinvent anew with the standardization that is offered to us by the Industrial Revolution. And what that's going to do is it's going to make residences more attainable for everyday people because of that have and have-nots. But long story short, in doing that, they started removing information sets from the natural environment. They took issue with form languages. They took issue with some of the natural kinds of materials, and they went with the industrial types of materials as concrete, things that could be manipulated differently. So unknowingly, they began to say, you know, too much information, extraneous information, we've got to control it. I think that's the tipping point where we began to see that the types of environments that we started creating were less human than those before.
So an example for that, just to illustrate to the audience, if you would, we're going to talk about the great picture that we both, after quite a longer discussion, choose to be the background picture. But if we would have chosen more, we could say for the latter, probably the urban fabric of Waikiki is a good demonstration. Whereas the previous one is the little village with the thatched roofs, right? Is that legitimate to say as sort of a
I do think when you're driving down the H1, you do see evidence of the Industrial Revolution. The tenets of that, I mean, because when you could standardize things and you could make them more available, you could produce more of them. There's an economics to it. So developers and builders are naturally going to do it, especially if it's been aestheticized by a group of architectural intellects saying that this is the way to do to create an international style. So when you are going down the H1, and especially in Waikiki, you see the big concrete towers, right? But you know, from living in Hawaii, and one of the reasons that I actually moved here was because it has this, mostly on the other islands, but it has this rich natural environment. They speak in, I've read like in places in Kauai where when you go into these natural environments, that they're almost special. They feel like there's a force or a deity or something at work there. We would argue that that connection, what's happening is in those natural environments, your neural structure is really intensely connecting like it wants, what it strives, what it really desires. And so, you know, you're feeling that it might be a profound moment, or that it might be a godlike thing or spiritual thing. We're saying that that's a real connection. So Hawaii has that juxtaposition. You know, you have, and we were just outside here, outside the studios earlier, and you have the concrete caverns, but you have the trees, and you have that kind of nature brought into it. So on a human scale, there are some real successes here. But when you look at the bigger piece, like again, the corridor, I drive every day down the H1, and so I see these big remnants. And I'm like, you know, would you really want to live in there? Is that what we want for people to be exposed to? You know, the pragmatics of the small space we're in, we do have to go vertical probably. But how do we treat those spaces? You and I had talked earlier about drywall. So
yeah, drywall. Bring it
up.
up.
Well, so we talked about this abstracted sort of utilitarianism that modernism brought to bear. And we talked about the standardization that the Industrial Revolution brought to manufacture. And so we were talking earlier about an example. You grow up in a house today, or in a condominium or an apartment, and you usually have some form of very simple wall behind you. Probably, I use drywall. It's just a simple white wall or an off-white wall, and that's it, right? And so we started saying that that kind of a wall has very little information that would engage your neurostructure, where your sense of well-being resides. And so we started saying, if it almost is as if it's sensory, it's like it's depriving you from sensory information. So we started looking at sensory deprivation studies in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and we began to find out that there's actually some truth to this, that in an environment that doesn't have enough information, a sensory deprived situation, you are uncomfortable. Your structures in your mind elicit anxiety, anxiousness, antisocial behavior, depression, and even hallucinations. So I don't think that a drywall room is going to do that.
Well, there's an interesting, when I look at the background picture of the pebbles, it reminds me of the major monopolist in the industry of drywall, right? They call it sheetrock.
Yep, sheetrock.
And I always allow myself to show my being very questionable about it, and to say, and this is probably inappropriate, but I say it anyways, I always tell my students it's like shit rock, right? Because nothing rocks about the drywall anymore, right? Because it's purely a construct of an industrialized Western civilization that basically says, how can I make the cheapest enclosure that on all these levels that you're talking about makes no sense? And maybe we should talk a little bit what we've done before about the inclusiveness of all the senses, maybe also in that matter, if you want to.
Well, let me just say what I know about drywall. Where I come from, they used to call that the poor man's plaster. You know, that's really what it was, because buildings prior to were plastered, but plaster took a long time to dry and all that. But honestly, in plaster and stucco applications, there's actually more levels when you move the trowel and you do this stuff. There's more opportunity to have greater information. So as to all of the senses, you know, we're not trying to negate sense of smell, taste, touch, and all that stuff. But because my research, and because I'm an architect, we were looking at the visual component mostly. Where you get the most information as an architect. Our field is very visual in these days, and we don't look at the other kinds of things. And so I'm not suggesting that these other dimensions of the environment are not important. We know they are. Our research, when we were looking at the natural world, we actually got invited to a conference. It was a closed conference that ended up creating a book called Biophilic Design. And Edward O. Wilson, who was a scientist who had looked at this, he'd coined the notion of biophilia, which is the love of nature, had said that there was a physiological kind of kinship between us and the natural world. And that's kind of what I spoke about in Kauai. Maybe that's that dimension. And that's what I was also referring to when I talked about the trees outside of here. in that biophilic conference, you had two camps. You had those people that wanted to put nature and plants in buildings, and those people that wanted to put buildings in nature and plants. And so,
can you hold that thought for
yes.
a second? Not to interrupt you, but I did. So
That's
we're going to show
okay.
a little commercial here. We're going to be back with
All
this interesting topic of philanthropic design and intelligence-based design.
all right.
Thank you.
Aloha, my name is Josh Green. I host a show called Healthcare in Hawaii here on ThinkTech. We get together once a week or sometimes twice a month. Depends. When we're busy, we get together less often, but we love to see you here to talk about the preeminent healthcare issues in our state. Our programs vary very widely. We talk about economics, we talk about healthcare, we talk about social issues on this program. Thanks for joining us.
So we're back with today's Urban Transcendence show, and Ken Masden and his topic of intelligence-based design, or officially we call it architecture and human intelligence. So this is really interesting. So we stopped when I had to interrupt you because of the break about the conference and the two different sort of leagues that were saying, you know, architecture in the building or buildings in the architecture.
Well, the biophilic group, either camp, the ones that wanted to put the buildings in the natural environment or the ones that wanted to bring the natural environment, were both trying to get at the same thing. They intuitively knew that these things had that connection that Edward O. Wilson talked about. But we had been looking at, I guess, just our idea in intelligence-based design had to do with the information that the natural environment gives to the neurological structures that would beget a sense of well-being. So we were at that conference not as biophilic architects, but as architects that were writing theories about that kind of connectivity. So in that, we began to, I think the paper was Neuroscience, the Natural Environment, and Building Design. And so we started to notice other research going on in Texas. Roger Ulrich was doing evidence-based design, which is about the healing qualities of having a natural environment or natural setting visible from a hospital room. And they've done clinical studies where you show that you heal faster in those situations. So that aligns itself with biophilia. If you see these plants, your sense of well-being is better. You heal faster than in a sterile white hospital room, very pragmatic, very much like the modernist industrial stuff. And so, but we noticed that Ulrich had also studied that if you had just images of the natural world, that you would heal faster too. So our position was that it wasn't simply that intrinsic physiological connection with nature, that it was your neurological structure's desire for complex organized information, which the natural environment provided, and which was what informed the structure and evolution of your brain. So that's the track we started moving away from, trying to look at impassive examples, and we quickly went to studies in artificial intelligence to try to understand the difference between what we called a direct information exchange or direct connection versus using stored information. So Rodney Brooks, I think he did the Mars lander, and he was studying artificial intelligence, which prior to had been constantly frustrated by the amount of information they were trying to store into computers and the thinking. They might tell the computer or the robot or the artificial intelligence, this is a door, this is a window, this is a floor. And that kind of stored information, like what we have stored in our memory and where our intellect and our values and beliefs come from, was found that it could be easily corrupted, it could be easily mismeshed, it could be, and so it would frustrate the robotics. So they started looking at direct information. In other words, what kind of intelligence, information, can you get from the environment without knowing that that's a door? In other words, knowing that you can move through it without knowing that it is a door or an opening and labeling it as such. And so they found that required far less storage of information, and they could train the robots to actually just move about, and it was a more effective way without having all the confusion of the signs and symbols. So we're at the very beginning of this, and what we said was, we do believe that what biophilia is talking about has a component. We certainly believe that the research in evidence-based design, but we believe that all of these things could be taken right back to how that neurological structure evolved and what our expectations are. so.
Yeah. Our audience, by the way, should be used to the terms, some of the terms you're using, basically EBD and post-occupancy evaluation I had used over the summer when I was doing shows, looking at the buildings we built and sort of reassessing them.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting. And, you know, getting to know you and our invigorating talks made me think about, in fact, the difference between evidence-based design and intelligence-based design, because you can evidence-base things that make no sense,
Yes,
right?
yes.
You can look in a
Yes.
fossil air-conditioned buildings, and you can say the air conditioning runs with good velocity, it's great. All the oil that gets pumped in there is used up efficiently, and so we're all going to be good. We feel good, we have 74 degrees. But is that intelligent?
No, I think in the first studies about the healing value of natural environments, we're using that, not, because I agree with you, evidence-based design has been mapped over everything, education and everywhere. And if you can evidence a reaction or a product, then you can do it. But I think in the original onset, in the clinical studies in hospitals, that's where we tapped into it by saying, we don't think it's simply a wonderful feeling you get from being around plants. We think that your brain is far more satisfied and at rest by having available information that makes it feel comfortable. For instance, in your limbic system is where the emotional component of your thinking is. And that's the earliest part of your brain, and that's where the fight and flight came about. So imagine for yourself in an environment where you're trying to survive, information becomes critical. And so when you see something in the tall thickets of grass, is it a lion that's going to kill you, or is it a pheasant that you can eat? So your sense of your emotional part comes out of that. It's tied to what they call agreeable and disagreeable sensations or impulses, which are tied to the avoidance of pain and the recurrence of pleasure, right? So in an environment, a natural environment, your neural structure feels naturally situated. In fact, in one of our papers, we talked about this being embedded sensorily, sensorily. And so in an environment that's abstracted, you don't have that sensoral connection. So you know it's artificial back here in your preconscious before you think and intellectualize it. And so this part of your brain is looking for a certain degree of complex, organized information. And in a hospital room, if it's not getting it, it's like, wait a minute. Should I be comfortable? Is something going to leap out and get me? Now, in the 21st century, we are smart enough to know that's not going to happen, so we can psychologically control that anxiousness. But that anxiousness is what we're trying to get at. We're trying to move and say that, because architecture from the Industrial Revolution moved really towards a visual expression. It moved towards first a simplistic formal expression, and then a complicated, random, deconstructed, arbitrary, complex thing. Well, we learned that not enough information is sensory deprivation. You have this anxiousness. Uniform information provokes the same kind of sensation, and random or exaggerated, like a fear of clowns. Chorophobia, I think it's called, chorophobia, because the exaggerated expression. So imagine when you were evolving and you were trying to not be eaten, something that looked like it was going to eat you had exaggerated. So whether it ties directly or not, but you have these kinds of information sets that make you feel anxious. Okay, so modern architecture did almost all of them. You know, it minimized, it uniformed, and it randomized.
And we have that on the island here. It makes me think. So I'm, trying to reflect on the things you say and try to get images that we're familiar with here on the island. So I already said, there's going to be the Polynesian Cultural Center or Bishop Museum where we can see, and Bishop Museum, we can see the richness of a culture through the act of making, right? And then we see sort of the reductiveness to efficiency of America coming and saying we got to build fast and cheap, basically. We see that. So then we can see sort of the returning point where we can see that a society is not happy with that anymore. So the industry is catering to that, and we have the Disney resort, we have Aulani there, right? It brings back the richness, but it's actually the illusion of it because it's all made under contemporary industrialized. If you knock on what you think is wood, it's fiberglass. So that gets me to the question of complexity, because I think it's important that you touch on, we had this critical discussion outside, which was great, that even though the wood, we're now at a point where we're making references to the movie industry about the first animated movies where you knew this is not real.
Right.
And we got now to the point where it is real, or it could be real. And it's the same in the building industry, that actually Aulani has done so well, you can't really tell. You have to knock, and even if you knock, the engineer, it's like with doors of cars, they engineer in a way that they sound more heavy than they are, because when they want to save cost. So, but that is my critical point about the complexity of things, that if you say intelligence is all encompassing everything, right, in a global way. So isn't it also most and foremost where the things come from and how you make it, that you make it, and it's not someone else making it, right? Everything in Aulani is made somewhere else, probably in China. It's going to be shipped in, and it gives the illusion of intelligence of a former sort of a vernacular tradition, right? What's your position on that?
Let me say this, and we talked about it, like you said, outside. I'm not trying to, I don't have an agenda, or I'm not trying to say this is bad or this is good, although it does sound like we're talking about modernism as if it's bad. I think it had its reason, and I'm glad for it. But so when we start back with the basics of just information, we argue that any complex, organized information, no matter how it's manufactured, is better than not having it, is better than that blank wall. So in varying degrees, yes, it would be great if all the environments we had could have nature in them. But we know the reasons why standardization not only took over construction, but it took over the building industry and life safety industry. And there's a lot of things that had to happen when we began to really increase densities and populations. Because if you just wanted to look at, so I guess now you have three models. We had discussed the issue in Manila, where we talked about the shanty constructs people live in along the Pasig River, and I had done a design studio with some students on that. And the outcome of what we were talking about was that juxtaposition between the very rich vernaculars, where they would have outside of the city, they had developed these bamboo houses, which were elevated for the livestock to be under, which were tied together with the twigs, which had the thatch roofs, and they're intelligence-wise, it's just talking about bits of information. There's far more information there. But the modern way of thinking, even in these people on the Pasig River, is they would move into these shipping containers. So shipping containers are an intellectualized aesthetic. As far as information is concerned, they're very minimal. They have just a rectangular shape, and they have some folds. If you were going to have, let's say, a kid grow up in either this thatched space or this abstracted kind of minimalist space, I believe that you'll find, and this is what the sensory deprivation studies of the 40s and 50s found, was in mental acuity and mental development, was that you'll find that this abstracted environment does not tap that brain's energy, whereas this natural vernacular environment does. Now, interestingly enough, bamboo is sustainable, and that practice is probably more sustainable. But you're offering now, we used to call the Disneyfication, no disrespect, but in terms of an artificial one of these huts built. I would argue that it's, in degrees of information, it's better still than the abstracted container. But your mind, even like when you see artificial wood that's plastic laminate, your mind knows the difference between that. It can see it. It has taken tremendous information storage in computer-generated movies to fool us into thinking what we're seeing is real. So you know where the dimension the brain works at. It wants the real stuff when possible. But architects, because of material expectations and limits of materials, we have to figure out how to use it more effectively, but be conscious of it.
All right, hold that thought. We're going to take another break, and we're going to be back with Ken's show, Intelligence-Based Design.
Hi, I'm Ethan Allen. I'm the host of Likeable Science on ThinkTech Hawaii. We talk about why people should like science, why science is actually fun, how science is a dynamic and vital part of everyone's life, why everyone, every man, woman, and child on the planet should really know science, should love science, should be familiar with science. So it's a great show. people come on here and have interesting conversations with us. They tell us why they do what they do, why they love it, why we should love it too. I hope you'll join us every Friday, 1 to 2 p.m. And of course, you can see it anytime on YouTube. Aloha.
So we're back with Ken and his exciting topic about architecture and human intelligence. And we're talking about, I would call it the authenticity of fakeness, or the fakeness of authenticity. I'm not quite sure what we're talking about. But we're talking, authenticity is actually one of our favorite terms that we both share, so maybe we use that a little bit to reflect.
Well, that's also a term which brought Nikos Salingros, who's my counter research fellow with this, together. But I was looking for an authentic architecture, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And he was looking for an honest. Nikos is a physicist, mathematician that is now a urban theorist and an architectural theorist. But when I did my first degree back in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was a modernist degree, a Le Corbusier school in Kentucky, if you can believe that. And so we were taught this sort of, didactic formalism. And then I went and I traveled and lived in other parts of the world. I lived in Naples, Italy for a couple of years. I lived in Iwakuni, Japan for 3. I traveled into China, all the places, Indonesia you want to go. I went back and did my graduate work. And I found myself with a modernism that had become architecture had become a visual formalism, different than a didactic formalism where just form was everything, surface was everything. And so I started having issues with that, and I found a philosopher, Karsten Harries, who's a Heideggerian philosopher, teaches at the graduate school where I went. He has an interest in architecture, and so one day I took a class, and I started writing about this authenticity. What is it, this dimension? Because I had gone to, we had a design project in Shanghai, China, and we were working with Hong Kong University and Tongji University out of Shanghai. And the issue was along the Suzhou Creek where it comes down and it was truncated by a dam, and to bring urban life back. And what became evident was that all of the Hong Kong students were designing to the Western paradigm of this formal complexity and intellectualism. Even the Tongji students who didn't quite understand our vernacular and that architectural vernacular of that formalism were trying that. But I thought it was an ethical or a moral problem, because I was watching like the work of Michael Graves pop up in Japan, and it didn't feel situated right. And I was starting to study with Karsten about ontology, which is the essence of being, and the research that your being manifests through the place in which he called it throne, is where you're born. If it was in the wooded forest in Germany or in the middle of the desert, that imprints on you. At the time I wasn't thinking about what really was going on. It's imprinting here, like if the kid is in the thatched building or the container, right? But so I was sitting in Shanghai going, well, how in the world can I take my thinking and my aesthetic sensibility and make it an ontological construct for these people? If I build something abstractly formal, and these kids grow up next to it, then it becomes a part of their ontology. It becomes, and I said, not that I'm greatly ethical or moral, I thought it just didn't seem right. So I looked into how I thought Chinese would understand building and spatiality, and I just constructed an idea where it was an armature above the city that would allow them to come in and build in the way that they would build, and allow them to flesh out the beast thing the way it was. So this idea of authenticity was kind of moving through now ontology. And it was still, it's philosophical. I had the great privilege of being able to have many conversations like this with Karsten, because he was interested in architecture and I happened to be interested in philosophy. This existential dimension of architecture, what it was initially. So when I came across Dr. Salingros, when I first went to teach at the University of Texas, San Antonio, we had a common colleague, Leon Creer. And Leon Creer was kind enough to call Nikos and say, hey, my student Ken is there, please make sure the corruption of tenure doesn't taint him too bad, or the pursuit of. And so that's where Nikos and I first started having a dialogue that led to these things.
Which is very important to have, as we have it here. So again, helping the audience a little bit about the background picture again. Another thing we talk about is about surface and substance. So my point is that yes, I remember vaguely because I was a young kid. I'm old, but not that old. So there was this photographic wallpapers where what you were implementing and saying, well, you can trigger through memory. You can trigger, positive feelings and emotions that can actually be good for you, both sort of physically and psychologically, and in combination and reciprocity. But my point is that just like with a thatch, if these pebbles would not just be a wallpaper, they wouldn't be reduced to this one sense, they would actually do more things, right? They would be tactile. And that's something we should probably, as a side note, not forget, although you're here as Ken Masden in all the capacities we talk about, but your daily occupation is working with the Department of Education, so you're very also knowledgeable about that on a daily basis, and you're also very critically reflective, which is much appreciated, about how this could implement, if so not the most important generation, the young ones, who within the hope lies, and Ali and my show here was initially based on the keiki that we said whenever we have the chance we want to talk about the children, so that the children. The tactile is very important because the tactile is something that basically this generation mostly doesn't have, because with us we use devices, we're kind of removed actually from, or we remove us from these things. So what are your thoughts about the surface and the substance?
I would agree that the three-dimensionality of this image behind us, and the reality of what it is it's a pavement on the ground. I think I took the picture in Japan, and if you could actually make that three-dimensional real with real stone, that is the best of all things. But you start getting in, you even spoke about the emotional component and the meaning component and the valuing and belief component. That gets to be real dicey because of ideology, because of religions, because of a lot of families and how you think and what you do. And so our research tried to, again, we went to artificial intelligence because it was the most impassive way to look at intelligence, as pure information, right? Not the intelligence that you and I are thinking about in terms of how we think, but just information is intelligence. So yes, I would agree that if within a school, if you can have a wall like this made out of, kind of like the blocks that you used in the bus terminal or the bus stations in your projects. That's one of the reasons that I started the dialogue with you, is because that is something worth having. Can you take one wall in a school, or two or more? Can you treat them in a way? But if you can't afford, and people will say, oh, it's hard to maintain, it's all these things. So can a image of this substitute? That's where we would say, yes, it's not as good as the real thing, but it's better than a blank wall. I think the point of the conversation is to, and what I was trying to do when I was in academia, is not to sell the idea, but simply make my students and other architecture students aware of this dimension of your neurological structure and how it thinks and what it wants. I still think there are places for abstractness. There's still places for blank walls. There's still places for those in terms of intellectual and valuing and meaning. But you don't know how to manipulate those effectively without knowing what really the human mind is looking for. So yeah, if you could do the real thing, I would argue that it's because that degree of information, just like we talked about in computer-generated movies, your mind really is more satisfied
with
what's real.
So I think that another way to describe it is terminology that I'm thinking about a lot is efficiency and effectiveness, right? Whereas in vernacular sort of arts and crafts and making, they were actually synthesized. They were actually, you tried to do something out of nothing. You make diamonds out of dirt and something from scratch. And you had to do it with the economy of means, because they were limited, the means were limited. So you basically did it in a way that it didn't take all your life, they put it together relatively fast, but they also took that time to make them. So the act of making and weaving things and thatching things. So I guess, as you said, industrialization had sort of separated that. And we basically said, let's do things only fast and quick so we can basically make a profit. And we didn't, that was our main driving force, and we ended up with being sort of deprived, because everything that went with the act of making sort of is this information we're missing. Now comes one more thing, is the removing means we don't know anymore how it's done, where it's done, and why it's done, and who does it, all these things, right?
I would, and I think I really believe this, but I really want to believe that the early modernist did not remove the information and standardize as a way to make a consumer product or make it more efficient. Turns out it was, given what they were working with back then in terms of industrial processes. They did it because they were trying to make better space more accessible to the masses. I think heretofore, where I'm from in Louisville, Kentucky, you have these beautiful limestone, complex Victorian houses where the wealthy lived. And they could afford all this carved limestone and fancy wood because the working class made $1 a day. So how do you give access? So in the beginning, I do think, I'd like to believe that the modernists were looking to as a social element, to make it more attainable to all people. But it did become more efficient to make, cheaper to make, bigger profit to make, and that's when you see it up and down the H1, because that's how you're going to get the space the fastest. Let's pour some concrete, make some blocks, and let's throw some wallpaper on it.
That's where we're basically, I think we'll allow ourselves to say we're critical, sort of capitalism corrupted it basically and hijacked, I guess, the modern idea, basically, and did that. So
I would agree with it. So, you know, in the end of this, I just would like people to really, and if we don't have time to go into the neurological structure, we don't have time to go into what the eye-brain system looks for, but I did do some design classes when I was a professor, and it's hard for architects, students, because we're visual in that we want something to look a certain way, but we don't fully understand how it operates. And one of the examples we used to give was, I think it was Aboriginal tribes that had seen an airplane fly over. So they took some twigs and some leaves and some branches, and they built what looked like an airplane and wondered why it wouldn't fly. There's a lot more to it, right?
Great. I should redo that assignment. That's wonderful.
So that's where it is. We just have to, architecture as a formal exercise is seductive, because you can just bend a piece of paper and turn something over to a student. They feel like they've done something. To really understand how humans, those that are not taught in our intellectual paradigm, come to understand the real world, you have to understand how the human mind works. And that's the point of our research.
That's excellent. So when I introduced you at the very beginning to say you're an acting and facilitating educator, I believe you will always teach, and no matter on who the audience is. Right now you teach tremendously. At your work you teach tremendously. When we talk, you teach, and I actually hope we have you back sort of more formally as well, because I think you have a lot to bring to the table, and I think to bring that sort of these pedagogies and teaching how to teach and you know, what do we learn, and I think the K-12, the whole discussion is currently a little removed or disconnected from our school, so hopefully we will have, you know, more collaboration on that in the future. And maybe sort of we're coming close to the end of the show. I have like 2 minutes left, but I want to say always there's, I mean, for me at least, at the end of the show, I wish, like, you know, everything we talk about could sort of urban transcendence-wise basically help to make the island, especially this one here, which is so much, as you pointed out, more than the other islands, sort of struggling with that kind of conflict, right? On the other islands, it's more or less sort of a little bit left the idyllic way. But what could that be? And what we talked about outside was that rather than sort of, I like that you say we don't want to be ideology again, because we want to allow diversity, and we don't want to say this is the thing to do and that's the. But I think what you were opting for and lobbying for and advocating was along the lines of the terms we basically used of being authentic. So you say it doesn't matter with what you build, but as long as it's thought through and it makes sense and it keeps the person, the people, in the center of the investigation as opposed to someone else, right, who wants to make a profit. I think that's your vision, isn't it?
I think it is. I think it's just, and I think Hawaii has a unique opportunity because we are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The architectural community can learn from each other, can change and do what they want and need to do. And so, you know, let's have more discussions about it and let's refine it, because It is really, our research is simply about that neurological part. But you're right. How do you advance that? How do you connect it? How does an architect like yourself utilize that? And where is it how does it work most effectively? So there's opportunities here.
Thank you very much,
Sure.
and for being here, and for that appetizer. I call it an appetizer to the audience, because he wants to know more. Please contact Ken directly. And so thank you very much
Sure.
for everything today. That was more than food for thought. And so,
Well, thank you for having me.
all right, thank you very much. So thank you guys for having been with us today, and see you next week in Urban Transcendence. It's going to be Alejandro Yamashita with a guest, and so see you then. Bye-bye.